A strike does not always change a battlefield. Sometimes it changes a calendar. On the 25th of December 2025, while much of the world was turned inward toward family tables and quiet roads, an American strike hit targets in Sokoto State in northwest Nigeria. U.S. Africa Command confirmed it happened in coordination with Nigerian authorities and described an initial assessment of multiple Islamic State militants killed. Nigeria's government said the targets were two Islamic State-linked camps in the Bounty Forest area, and it framed the operation as a precision action designed to disrupt planned attacks. The Nigerian account also described the strike as launched from maritime platforms in the Gulf of Guinea, and it offered a specific figure: 16 precision-guided munitions, while the US military did not publicly confirm those technical details. That gap matters, because the most dangerous space in geopolitics is the space between what is documented and what is merely repeated. In that space, rumor grows stale. In that space, narratives become weapons. And in West Africa, where memory is long and trust is often thin, the first question is rarely what exploded. It is who held the pen when the order was signed. If truth matters more than noise, press like, not as a favor, but as a quiet signal that you want the ledger kept clean. We will follow what is on the record, and we will separate what is documented from what is disputed, even when the dust tries to hide the footprints. Now, start with what we can say without theater. This was not presented by either side as a war declaration. It was presented as counterterrorism cooperation, a strike at Nigeria's request, approved by Nigeria's leadership, with Nigeria publicly owning the coordination. That public ownership is not a small detail. It is the hinge on which everything else swings. Because when a sovereign state asks for help, the moral language changes, but so does the strategic language. A request is also a contract. A contract, in turn, can become a habit. And habits, in security, can quietly become dependency. The second thing we can say is just as simple. Sokoto is not the Sahel, but it is not far from the Sahel's shadow. The northwest of Nigeria sits near routes that have long carried people, goods, weapons, and influence across borders that were drawn with rulers, not with local consent. When officials speak of foreign elements infiltrating through the wider belt of instability, they are pointing to a reality that does not respect passports. But it is also a reality that invites exaggeration, because a corridor can be described as a threat even when the public cannot see the evidence that makes it so. And that brings us to the third thing we can say without pretending certainty. Key details remain contested in the public conversation. The US side has not laid out the technical story in full. The Nigerian side has shared more of it. That is normal in military affairs. But it also means this story is ripe for misuse by partisans in Washington, by rivals in the region, by anyone who needs a headline to prove a worldview. So let us treat the strike not as a punchline, but as a document, a line in a ledger. Because the strike's real power is not only in what it hit, but in what it forces everyone to think about: permission, leverage, and the shape of the region's next decade. And this is where Ibrahim Traore returns to the center of the story. Not because he planned the strike, not because he commanded it. There is no public evidence for that, and we will not indulge fantasies. He returns to the center because he has become a symbol, a shorthand for supporters and critics alike, for a Sahel that is trying to rewrite its relationship with external power. Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso stands at the head of a political mood that can be summarized in a single sentence: we will not be governed from afar. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Ouagadougou, the language of sovereignty is not academic. It is emotional. It is the language of calloused hands that have carried the cost of insecurity for years, while decisions were often explained in foreign accents and filed in foreign capitals. When a strike lands in the wider belt of West Africa, with American fingerprints and official Nigerian consent, it becomes more than a tactical event. It becomes raw material, soil for competing narratives. One narrative says, this is partnership, a sovereign request answered. a practical move against militants who do not respect borders. In this telling, the strike is a tool, not a leash. Another narrative says this is how influence returns when bases are gone. Not with flags planted in the ground, but with capabilities that arrive and depart like a weather system. In this telling, the strike is a reminder. Even when a foreign footprint shrinks, reach can remain. And the third narrative, the one that pulls Traore back into frame, says sovereignty is not a slogan, it is a system. If external power can act quickly when invited, then the question becomes whether the region can build enough internal capacity that such invitations are rare, limited, and always on terms the public can understand. Notice what is happening here. The strike becomes a mirror. People look into it and see what they already fear, what they already hope, what they already believe. That is why, in the hours after the event, you will see arguments multiply faster than facts. Some will treat it as proof of strength, others as proof of vulnerability, others as proof of betrayal. But the ledger, the boring discipline ledger, asks different questions. Who publicly requested the action? What did the US side confirm and what did it not confirm? What did Nigeria's government claim, and how should we frame those claims when independent verification is limited? What is known about the target area from credible reporting, and what is merely a social media echo? This is the work the Sahel Ledger exists to do. Receipts over rumors, not because we distrust everyone, but because the region has paid too many times for stories told without receipts. Now, widen the lens, just slightly. For much of the last decade, the Sahel story has been told as a crisis that moves north to south. Militants in remote spaces, states stretched thin, alliances formed under pressure. But there is another movement underneath that story, quieter and more consequential. The movement of legitimacy. The question of who is legitimate to act, who is legitimate to advise, who is legitimate to patrol, to strike, to define the problem and propose the solution. In that deeper current, symbols matter. The alliance of Sahel states, the political project joining Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, is not only a security arrangement. It is a claim about legitimacy, that the people of the interior can coordinate their future without being managed by the coastline and without being supervised by distant patrons. Nigeria, by contrast, is the coastline's giant, the demographic and economic weight that cannot be ignored. When Nigeria cooperates openly with Washington, it changes the tone of the whole regional conversation. It does not prove a conspiracy. It does not prove a master plan, but it does prove that the old equation, foreign influence equals bases on the ground, is not the only equation in play. And if that equation is changing, then those who have built their legitimacy on resisting foreign supervision will naturally step into the spotlight. They will speak louder. They will frame harder. They will argue that the lesson is not to panic, but to build. So yes, a strike in northwest Nigeria can pull Ibrahim Traore back to the center of the Sahel story without any secret meeting, without any hidden hand. It only requires one thing: a region already primed to interpret security events as signals about sovereignty. Here is the final thought to carry into what comes next. In West Africa, power is not only what you can do, it is what others believe you can do and what they believe you might do next. That belief spreads like dust in Harmattan season. It settles on everything, even the truth, until someone wipes the surface clean. We are going to wipe it clean, because the next question is not about the strike itself. The next question is about the hinge it exposes, the state that can tilt the board without ever firing a shot. And once you see that hinge, you will understand why the entire region is suddenly watching Abuja as closely as it watches Ouagadougou. And that is where this story really tightens. The first battle in this story is not fought in the forest, it is fought on the clock. Some outlets called it a Christmas Day strike, others spoke of the night after. People shared clips and captions stamped 26th of December as if the date itself were proof of something hidden. But time zones and local reporting windows can turn one event into two rumors. And rumors, in this region, travel faster than any aircraft. Here is what is on the public record. U.S. Africa Command confirmed that an American strike took place in Sokoto State in northwest Nigeria on the 25th of December 2025. They stated it was done in coordination with Nigerian authorities and said an initial assessment indicated multiple Islamic State militants were killed. They did not, however, publicly detail the platform, the route, or the specific munitions used, a familiar practice in military communications when operational security is invoked. Nigeria's government offered a fuller description. In that account, the targets were two Islamic State-linked camps in the Bounty Forest area around Tangaza, and the operation was approved at the highest level. That same Nigerian account described the action as being launched from maritime platforms in the Gulf of Guinea and put a number on the effort: 16 precision-guided munitions. Whether every technical detail can be independently verified from open sources is a different question, and in this ledger, those questions stay open until receipts arrive. But the structure of the story is clear. Nigeria did not deny the cooperation, it embraced it. That is the first hinge. Because there is a difference between a state being acted upon and the state acting in concert. The first breeds outrage. The second breeds argument. And argument, even when it is uncomfortable, is a sign of politics still breathing. Now anchor the geography, because geography is the quiet author of nearly every decision in West Africa. Sokoto is not a coastal showcase. It is not Lagos. It is not Abuja's polished boulevard. Sokoto sits closer to the hard edges, to the northern belt where insecurity has spilled across years, across administrations, across promises. The Bounty Forest area, as described in Nigerian reporting, is not a symbol, it is a place. A patch of terrain where armed groups can hide, move, recruit, and threaten. In that sense, a strike there fits the plain counterterrorism logic that officials want the public to accept, but counterterrorism rarely lives alone. It always shares a room with perception. If the strike is understood as a clean partnership, it strengthens the argument that Nigeria can call in help when it chooses, strike where it chooses, and remain the author of its own security narrative. If the strike is understood as a precedent, as a door opened, it strengthens the fear that once a powerful partner is invited in, even through a narrow crack, that partner may later expect the door to stay ajar. Both readings can exist at once. That is not paranoia. That is politics. So before we climb into grand theory, we have to do something disciplined, separate three layers that are often mashed together. First, there is the tactical layer. Who was hit, where, and with what immediate aim. On the public record, both sides point to Islamic State-linked targets and an intention to disrupt future attacks. The language is standard. The framing is careful. Second, there is the procedural layer. Who requested, who authorized, and who owns the action publicly. Here, the record matters more than the rumor mill. Nigeria's officials did not hide behind ambiguity. The choice alone shapes regional interpretation. Third, there is the strategic layer. What this cooperation means in a wider map, where alliances are shifting, military footprints are changing, and legitimacy is being renegotiated. The competitor script you shared tried to jump straight to that third layer, and it did so with one major factual misstep that we must correct before we go any further, because one wrong brick can tilt an entire wall. Agadez is not in Nigeria, it is in Niger. For years, the American drone base at Agadez, known as Air Base 201, was a major node in US operations across the Sahel. But the story of the United States losing that node is not a Nigerian decision in 2023. The public reporting and official timelines place the US withdrawal from Niger in 2024, with departures from Niamey's Air Base 101 and Agadez's Air Base 201. Whatever one thinks of that withdrawal, the key point is simple. It was about Niger, not Nigeria. If that clarification helped you see the map a little more clearly, a quiet thank you in the comments is more than enough. And now, let's move to the next piece. Because once you correct the map, the logic sharpens. When a military posture loses inland infrastructure, it does not always abandon the region. Often it adapts. It looks for new ways to maintain reach, new partnerships to sustain visibility, new routes to project power without the same footprint. That is not a conspiracy. It is how states behave when they are trying to avoid a strategic blindness, and it is here that the coastline becomes more than scenery. Nigeria's coastal access, its maritime domain, and its regional weight make it a natural center of gravity for any external actor trying to remain relevant in the wider belt. That does not mean Nigeria is a puppet, it means Nigeria is a bridge, and bridges attract traffic. Now consider the Nigerian side with equal honesty. Nigeria has carried a heavy domestic security burden for years. Different governments have promised different remedies. Citizens, especially in regions repeatedly harmed by insecurity, do not live inside policy papers. They live inside consequences. When a government is judged by whether people feel safe traveling a road, whether markets can open without fear, whether farmers can plant without looking over their shoulders, then the pressure to show decisive action becomes immense. A partnership that can deliver rapid, visible disruption to armed groups is politically valuable. That is true in any country, not only Nigeria, but the value comes with a trade-off. Once a state's security narrative is reinforced by an external capability, the public may begin to ask what portion of control is domestic and what portion is borrowed. Borrowed strength can help in the short term. In the long term, borrowed strength can become a question mark. And West Africa is in an era where question marks are multiplying. Since early 2025, the region has been living through a formal political rupture. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger's departure from ECOWAS took effect at the end of January. Whether one sees that rupture as reckless or overdue, it changes the diplomatic weather. It changes expectations. It changes how every security event is interpreted because the region no longer speaks with the same institutional voice. In that new weather, any cooperation between a major coastal power and the United States will be read through competing lenses: partnership, dependency, deterrence, provocation. The strike then becomes a seed, and seeds do not choose what grows from them. Soil does. So here is the final tightening of part 2. What happened in Sokoto is, in public terms, a counterterrorism action. But the reason it reverberates beyond Sokoto is that it intersects with a wider transition. A Sahel interior rebranding sovereignty as a political project, a coastal giant balancing domestic necessity with regional perception, and an external power adjusting after losing inland basing in Niger. You can feel the tension already, like dust in the throat before a storm. Not because anyone has declared a new war, but because everyone is quietly recalculating. And when recalculation begins, symbols rise. In the next part, we will look at why one particular symbol, Ibrahim Traore, is pulled back into the center whenever sovereignty and external reach collide, and why a single operation can become a megaphone for an entire narrative, even when the facts on the ground remain narrower than the story in people's heads. A strike is an action. A narrative is an architecture, and West Africa, right now, is not only fighting armed groups in difficult terrain, it is also fighting over who gets to build the architecture of meaning, who gets to name events, frame them, file them into history, and turn them into policy. That is why Ibrahim Traore returns to the center of the Sahel story whenever the question of external reach collides with the question of sovereignty. He returns not because he controls Nigeria, not because he controls Washington, and not because he controls what happens in the forests of Sokoto. There is no public evidence for any of that, and pretending otherwise would be theater, not analysis. He returns because he has become a symbol in a contest that is bigger than any single strike. The contest between a region that wants to be authored from within, and a world that has spent decades treating West Africa as a page to be annotated from afar. Think of it like soil. A seed does not decide the harvest. The soil decides what the seed becomes. In a region where many citizens carry a lived memory of external tutelage, economic templates, security templates, partnerships that sometimes felt like instruction. The soil is primed. So when a high-profile counterterrorism operation happens with a foreign power involved, even with local consent, it drops into that soil and begins to grow meaning far beyond its tactical footprint. One person sees a necessary tool, another sees a dangerous precedent. A third sees a warning, a fourth sees an opening, and none of them needs to invent secret meetings for this to happen. They only need a region where trust is precious, where security is painful, and where legitimacy is being renegotiated in real time. And legitimacy is the key word. The Sahel interior has been moving through a formal political rupture. Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger have left the regional bloc they were once bound to, and they are building a new framework, a new banner, a new vocabulary of cooperation. That does not automatically make the project successful. It does not automatically make it wise. It does not automatically make it stable. But it does mean this: the center of the argument has shifted. The argument is no longer only about tactics against militants. It is about who sets the terms of partnership, who controls the tempo of security decisions, and who gets to claim dignity without asking permission. In that argument, Traore's role is simple and powerful. He embodies the idea that sovereignty is not a polite request, it is a working system. A system with borders that matter. A system with decisions made in the open. A system with institutions that can say yes or no with confidence. That is why a single event can pull him into view. Because once a public debate begins about external involvement in a major state like Nigeria, every voice associated with sovereignty in the region becomes louder by default. Not because they are orchestrating the debate, but because the debate validates their central theme. That security cooperation can slide into security dependency if the region does not build its own capacity. Now we need to be careful here. And this is where most commentary fails. It is tempting to take the US strike and treat it as proof of a grand strategy. It is tempting to say it was a message, a rehearsal, a test run, because those words sound sharp, and sharp words travel. But the ledger does not treat temptation as evidence. What is documented is this: a strike occurred, it was coordinated, it targeted Islamic State linked camps according to Nigeria's public account, and the US confirmed the action without providing the technical detail. What is debated is what it means. So let us talk about meaning in the only responsible way, as an effect, not a claim of intent. The effect is that the region is forced to look again at the mechanics of power, not just power as soldiers, but power as reach, power as visibility, power as the ability to act quickly, quietly, and at distance. In the old mental model, foreign power in the Sahel looked like bases on the ground. Runways, hangars, convoys, flags at the gate, but the last 2 years have shown how quickly that model can change when political winds shift. When Niger's government ended military cooperation and the US withdrew, the visible footprint shrank. That is factual history. But shrinking a footprint does not automatically shrink interest. It often forces innovation. And when innovation happens, the question becomes, who provides the bridge? Here is where Nigeria matters, and why the story pulls the Sahel leaders, especially the most symbolically potent among them, back into the frame. Nigeria is not simply another state in the region. Nigeria is weight. Nigeria is coastline. Nigeria is a regional artery. And when a state like Nigeria publicly coordinates with an external power, it creates a signal. Not necessarily a deliberate signal, but a signal in the way traffic patterns signal where the road is open. That signal is what the sovereignty camp reacts to. It is what their audiences react to. It is what their opponents react to. Because the signal can be read as partnership, yes, but it can also be read as the reappearance of a familiar pattern, external capability becoming intertwined with domestic legitimacy. In the short term, that intertwining can be politically valuable. A government under pressure to demonstrate action can point to a decisive operation and say, we are not passive, we are moving. But in the medium term, the same intertwining can become a vulnerability. Citizens begin to ask, if security success is associated with a foreign partner, who owns the success? And if something goes wrong, if the public doubts the targets, if communities feel unfairly stigmatized, if fears of outside control rise, who pays the political price? This is not abstract. This is the fault line. A state can fight militants and still fracture socially if the narrative of the fight is not trusted. That is why you will hear different voices in Nigeria pulling in different directions. Some will say, use every tool available, the threat is too serious. Others will say, be careful, the price of border strength can be the erosion of strategic autonomy. Those are not extremist positions. Those are normal positions in a democracy and in any state with politics still alive. And now pivot back north to the Sahel interior, because that is where Traore's centrality becomes unavoidable. When the interior bloc speaks about sovereignty, it is not only speaking about borders. It is speaking about economic choices, information choices, and security architecture. But we must avoid exaggeration. The idea of a shared currency is often invoked in online commentary as if it is around the corner. Public fact-checking has poured cold water on that, describing it as a long-term ambition, years away, not a switch to be flipped next month. That matters because it changes what we should focus on. The real near-term story is not a currency, it is coordination. It is the acceleration of language around joint security mechanisms, shared intelligence, shared posture, not as a fantasy army that appears overnight, but as a political project trying to become operational over time. Public reporting has described discussions of a joint force in the low thousands. Whether those plans deliver is another question, but the intention to coordinate is real enough to shape the region's psychology. And psychology is where Traore operates as a centerpiece. He speaks to the calloused hands, to the farmers and traders who want roads that can be traveled without fear, to the young people who hear partnership and wonder whether it means dignity or dependency. In a region tired of being told it is perpetually unfinished, he embodies a refusal. We will not wait for someone else to bring the dawn. This is where we must place the keyword once and only once, so it serves the story rather than hijacking it. The US. Strike in Nigeria becomes, in the public conversation, a mirror held up to the region's deepest question: whether sovereignty is a slogan or a system. And if you want this work to stay independent, consider joining as a member. We'll keep the lights on for careful analysis, and we'll keep separating what's documented from what's disputed, even when the headlines try to pull us into certainty we have not earned. Now tighten the thread. If Traore is pulled back to the center by the narrative gravity of sovereignty, then the next question is not what did he say. The next question is what does the region do with the meaning of this event, because meaning becomes policy. If Nigeria treats this as a one-off tool, carefully limited, transparently explained, the precedent is small. If Nigeria treats this as a template, a repeatable model for crisis response, then the precedent is large, and the Sahel interior will respond accordingly. Not necessarily with retaliation, not necessarily with confrontation, but with acceleration. Acceleration of coordination, acceleration of rhetoric, acceleration of efforts to reduce vulnerability to external pressure. Not because anyone wants chaos, because no one wants to be surprised. The problem is that in West Africa's current weather, acceleration on one side is often interpreted as provocation on the other. And that is how misunderstanding becomes momentum. So here is the question that ends part 3 and opens the door to part 4. If the Sahel interior is building a political project around sovereignty and the coastline's giant is managing a security partnership that can be framed as either help or leverage, what happens when global actors begin to treat Nigeria not as a country but as a corridor, a bridge they must hold? Because once a bridge becomes strategic, it also becomes contested. And that is when the story stops being about one strike and starts being about the international board. If you want to understand why this story refuses to stay inside Nigeria, you have to stop looking at borders as lines and start looking at them as conversations. Borders are where trade happens, where families stretch across maps, where fear can travel, where hope can travel too. And when a strike lands near a region already tense with history, it becomes a sentence in a much longer paragraph, one that is being read, misread and rewritten in capitals far beyond Sokoto. So let's step out of the forest and into the chamber. In Washington, the public language around events like this tends to be disciplined. Coordination, counterterrorism, partner request, initial assessment. It is meant to communicate control without revealing method. It is meant to reassure domestic audiences that action is targeted and lawful, and to reassure partners that cooperation remains possible. That is not unique to the United States. It is what powerful states do when they want to act and also be seen to act responsibly. But here is the complication, and it is the quiet heart of the international story. The United States is operating in a West African environment that looks different after the withdrawal from Niger in 2024. A loss of a basing does not automatically mean a loss of attention. Often it means a shift in how attention is maintained. More reliance on partners, more emphasis on maritime access, more use of intelligence networks that can be sustained without the same visible footprint. This is not a secret plan, it is the predictable behavior of any actor trying to avoid becoming blind. And that is why Nigeria's cooperation carries a weight that goes far beyond the immediate targets. Because Nigeria is not simply a partner. Nigeria is geography that speaks. It is coastline and corridors, population and economy, a diplomatic gravity that smaller states cannot replicate. When Nigeria coordinates openly, it does two things at once. It gains capacity in the short term, and it signals to every observer that the door to cooperation at scale remains open, not in the Sahel interior, but in the coastal belt that still anchors so much of the region's logistics and legitimacy. To some, that is stabilizing. To others, it is alarming. And to rivals of the United States, it is an opening. This is where many commentaries become reckless, painting foreign capitals as cartoon villains, moving pieces in the dark. The Sahel Ledger does not do cartoons. We do receipts over rumors. So we will not claim secret orders. We will not claim motives we cannot prove. But we can still describe incentives, because incentives leave fingerprints even when intentions remain private. For Washington, the incentive is straightforward. Maintain partnership and visibility in a region where the political ground can shift quickly. If you cannot rely on inland basing, you lean harder on coastal relationships. If your footprint shrinks, you protect your reach. That is a structural incentive, not a moral judgment. For Abuja, the incentive is also straightforward. Show progress against insecurity, reassure citizens, and avoid being caught between competing regional narratives. A government facing relentless pressure to deliver tangible security results will often embrace tools that work quickly, especially when those tools can be framed as sovereign choice rather than foreign imposition. And that framing matters, because framing is the currency of legitimacy. Now widen the circle to the region's institutions. ECOWAS has been weakened by the departure of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, a rupture that became formal at the end of January 2025. That formal rupture means the old language of regional consensus is harder to speak with confidence. Some member states still see ECOWAS as the necessary architecture for stability and trade. Others see it as a structure that failed to protect dignity when it mattered most. Those differences do not vanish because a communiqué is released. They sit in the room during every crisis, including this one. So when Nigeria coordinates with the United States, ECOWAS becomes part of the background music, sometimes loud, sometimes barely audible, but always present. Some voices will interpret the cooperation as a responsible measure that helps prevent spillover. Others will interpret it as a sign that regional problems are still being managed through external capability rather than regional capacity. That tension is not going away, because it is rooted in a deeper question. What does partnership look like when sovereignty is the central political demand? Now step beyond the region for a moment. In Moscow and Beijing, West Africa is not viewed through the same moral lens as Washington. It is viewed through strategic lenses: influence, access, resources, routes, and narrative advantage. Those capitals have their own interest and their own vocabulary. When the United States cooperates militarily with a major African state, competitors can use it to reinforce their arguments about dependency. Not because they are neutral observers, but because the narrative is useful. At the same time, those competitors will also quietly watch for instability, because instability threatens investment and predictability, and unpredictability is expansive. In Europe, the atmosphere is often one of concern and fatigue. Concern about instability, migration pressure, and regional spillover. Fatigue because previous interventions and partnerships have not produced the clarity that policymakers hoped for. Europe is not one mind, it is many governments with different appetites for risk and different memories of the Sahel. But a common thread remains. European actors are increasingly reacting to events rather than shaping them. And across the wider Middle East, some wealthy states have been exploring roles as mediators or investors, looking for opportunities where old alignments have frayed. In a region where the language of conditionality has left scars, money that arrives with fewer public lectures can look attractive, even if it comes with its own strings. Again, that is not a conspiracy, it is how influence markets work. So where does this leave us? It leaves us in a situation where one coordinated strike becomes a prism. Different capitals look through it and see different futures. Washington sees cooperation and continued relevance. Abuja sees capability and political breathing room, alongside the risk of the backlash. The Sahel interior sees a familiar pattern that strengthens the case for self-reliance and tighter coordination. Competitors see narrative fuel. Regional institutions see another stress test. And ordinary people see the oldest question of all. Will tomorrow be safer than today? This is the moment where we must speak plainly about what is documented and what remains debated. It is documented that the strike occurred and that coordination was publicly confirmed. It is documented that Nigeria described the action as being launched from maritime platforms. It is documented that the United States did not publicly confirm those technical details. It is debated publicly how to interpret the broader meaning. And it is in that debate that Ibrahim Traore is pulled back into center frame because he is one of the region's most recognizable voices for a sovereignty-first reading of events. That is why this story is not just a counterterrorism story. It is a legitimacy story. And legitimacy is not built with slogans. It is built with systems. Systems of accountability, systems of communication, systems of capability, systems of trade, systems of cooperation that do not erase dignity. This is what people mean, sometimes without even realizing it, when they talk about Sahel security. They are not only talking about armed groups, they are talking about whether the region can build a future where the pen stays in local hands, even when partnerships are necessary. Where are you watching from? City and country? From the Sahel Ledger, I'm wishing you a steady dawn and a clear road ahead. And we will keep the record precise, separating what's documented from what's disputed every step of the way. Now, hold that thought, because the international board is only half the picture. The other half is the road ahead, the choices that do not belong to Washington or Moscow or Brussels, but to the people and governments of the region itself. A strike can be a moment, but what comes after is a direction, and the next part is about direction. Because once a bridge becomes strategic, it also becomes pressured, and Nigeria is that bridge. The question is not whether the world is watching. The question is what Nigeria does when the watching turns into weight. A bridge is beautiful when it carries trade. A bridge is dangerous when it carries rivalry. Nigeria in this story is both. A coastline that can open routes. A way that can tilt institutions. A corridor that can connect the Sahel interior to the wider world, or become the pressure point that others try to hold. So what is the road ahead after the Christmas strike in Sokoto? The honest answer is not a prophecy, it is a set of choices, and the courage to name the trade-offs those choices demand. First, there is the choice of transparency. A state does not weaken itself by telling its people the truth. It strengthens itself. In a region where suspicion can spread like dust on the harmattan, clarity is a form of defense. When the public hears cooperation but cannot see the terms, anxiety fills the gap. When the public hears technical claims that cannot be independently verified, rumor rushes in to complete the story. The safest path for legitimacy is not secrecy. It is precision. What was requested, what was authorized, what was hit, what is known, what remains uncertain, and what safeguards exist to prevent drift from partnership into dependence. That is not a Western lecture. It is a sovereignty practice. The pen stays in local hands when citizens can read the page. Second, there is the choice of proportionality. Counterterrorism cannot be only an aerial event. If it becomes only an aerial event, it may create moments of disruption without building durable safety. Durable safety grows like a harvest, seed, soil, seasons. It requires policing that communities can trust, courts that can prosecute without fear, intelligence that does not stigmatize whole populations, and economic roads that give young people alternatives to armed groups. The strike may have offered a tactical gain, but tactical gain is not a substitute for institutions. A state that relies on moments will always be exhausted. A state that builds systems can breathe. Third, there is the choice of regional diplomacy. The region is not a clean map of two camps. It is a messy neighborhood. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have taken a formal step away from ECOWAS, and that departure became effective at the end of January 2025. That legal fact does not erase geography. Trade still crosses borders. Families still cross borders. Threats still cross borders. So the most important work may happen not in grand summits, but in practical channels, deconfliction, shared border coordination where possible, and the quiet lowering of temperature. A region that fractures diplomatically often becomes easier to manipulate strategically, not because everyone is evil, but because division creates openings. That is why Nigeria's posture matters. Nigeria can choose to speak to both sides without pretending neutrality is effortless. Nigeria can choose to treat itself not as a pawn, but as a steward of stability. And stewardship in politics is often harder than dominance. Now here is where Ibrahim Traore returns one last time, not as a commander in this event, but as a mirror for what the region is debating. Traore's symbolic power comes from a single demand: dignity. The insistence that partnership must look like partnership, not supervision. That demand resonates because many people in the region have lived the opposite, not always through direct colonial rule, but through the afterlife of it. Templates written elsewhere, conditions set elsewhere, crises narrated elsewhere. When an American operation happens in West Africa with a major state's consent, the sovereignty question does not disappear. It intensifies. It becomes a test of whether partnership can be pursued without losing authorship. This is why the story pulls him back into the center of the Sahel conversation. Not because he owns the facts of Sokoto, but because he owns a piece of the region's emotional vocabulary. He speaks for those who believe the Sahel must stop being managed and start being built. But symbols are not enough. The ledger demands systems. And that takes us to the final practical question. What can be done without fantasy to reduce the region's exposure to this kind of narrative shock? One answer is capacity that can be measured, not slogans, not ceremonies. Measurable capability, improved border intelligence that respects communities, joint training among willing partners, investment in communications that tell citizens what is known and what is not, and trade corridors that function so that economies do not suffocate under insecurity. Another answer is economic dignity. The principle that trade over aid is not a chant, it is infrastructure. Roads that hold in rainy season, markets that can open without fear, power that can run cold storage, and small industry. When livelihoods grow, the recruiting pools shrink. When farmers can harvest, the soil yields peace as well as food. A third answer is narrative discipline. This matters more than people like to admit. When every incident becomes proof of a grand plot, society becomes anxious. When every incident is denied as if nothing matters, society becomes cynical. The middle path, the hard path, is to say this is what we know, this is what we do not know, and this is what we refuse to pretend. That is why this channel exists. Not to inflame, not to flatter, not to sell a myth, to keep the ledger. Now, before we close, we need to obey the discipline of the prompt and lock in our SEO naturally without turning the ending into a keyword dump and without degrading the voice. Here is the truth we can carry forward without distortion. The US strike in Nigeria was publicly confirmed as coordinated counterterrorism action, and its ripple effect is inseparable from the wider question of Sahel security. Whether people interpret it as partnership or precedent, the US strike in Nigeria has already done one thing. It has pulled the sovereignty debate back into the center of the region's conversation, and that is why Sahel security is now being argued not only with weapons, but with words, legitimacy, and systems. If you believe dignity matters more than noise, subscribe and share this with one calm mind, not for fury, not for spectacle, but for receipts over rumors. That is what we do here at the Sahel Ledger, because the future will not be built by the loudest claim, it will be built by the steadiest hands. And in West Africa, those hands are tired, but they are not broken. They are calloused from work. They know the weight of a hoe, the grip of a steering wheel, the heat of a market day. They know what it means to plant when the sky is uncertain. They know what it means to keep going anyway. The dawn will not arrive because a foreign power permits it. It will arrive because a region decides to build it, bridge by bridge, road by road, system by system, truth by truth. And next time, we will follow the bridge itself. Nigeria as the hinge state, and how a country of immense weight can choose to be an anchor for stability rather than a corridor for pressure.